Hello, everybody. If I haven't met you before, my name's Nathan. I'm in second year. If you cast your minds back last week, you might remember we heard a disembodied sermon from 1 Corinthians chapter 6 about the theology of the body. And since then, I've been thinking a lot about whether there's been aspects of how I live my life in my body that reflect a preference to not be connected as a member of Jesus, of Christ. Growing up in a culture that's very health-obsessed, obsessed about healthy recipes, healthy lifestyles, healthy minds, healthy bodies, it's been easy for me to kind of adopt pursuing and maintaining health as a part of my discipleship, making honoring God with my body all about living a healthy life. However, over the last week, I've been wrestling with what it might mean for me and for my body with all its appetites, its limitations, its abilities, and its scars to belong not to me, but to the Lord. And as I think about cross-cultural mission in the future, thinking about, am I willing to trust that my body is important to Him? Am I willing for Him to take it to places where noise and pollution, diet, or more limited access to healthcare might mean becoming a less healthy body? And I've been challenged to reflect, do I want to call all the shots regarding my body and my health? Or am I willing to be bound to Him, the God of the broken and the resurrected body? And we're going to be reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, from verses 1 to verse 16. And so please join along with me as we listen to God. Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest, I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?
Thank you, Nathan. Good afternoon, everyone. Special thank you to the student reps who organised last night's fire pit night, which was fantastic. One of my girls, as I put her to bed last night, said, best night ever. Ravi has been married to Mia for 6 months. Marriage is going okay so far, but he finds that he's dreading sex. When Mia tries to create a romantic atmosphere by making a nice meal, lighting a candle, or kissing him, it feels dirty or wrong to Ravi. Sex was a taboo topic in his conservative Christian home growing up, so he feels like he's working this all out from scratch. Lena is a 28-year-old single woman. She became a Christian at uni and she's a virgin. As a single Christian, she's striving to live a celibate life, but she's finding it hard. She has strong sexual feelings and she feels them often. The other day, her non-Christian friend Naomi said something to her which she's been ruminating on ever since. Naomi said, "You believe what you want to believe, Lena. I respect your freedom in that. But what I can't respect is a religion that causes harm. And that's what your religion is doing to you. Telling someone to not have sex, to not fulfill their natural appetites, telling someone not to express themselves, not to be themselves sexually. How can you even discover who you are with those kind of religious rules controlling your life?" Kai and Kalina are a Christian couple who've been married for 17 years. They've got 3 kids. They rarely have sex anymore. The chemistry seems to have gone. They argue quite a lot. Kai's always wanted to play in a band, but Kalina doesn't like his taste in music, and she says that the family doesn't have time for him to do that. Kalina really wants to advance her career by moving to the city, but Kai says no way are they going to leave the country town where they've grown up. Kai feels like the marriage is stifling his individuality and freedom. Kalina feels like the marriage is stifling her individuality and freedom. Both are starting to wonder, would it be better if we separated? Well, welcome to the complex world of sex and relationships. All over the world, people are grappling with issues like these and many more. People, including us here in this room today. Now, something which is going to be crucial with this grappling as we do it is the set of beliefs that we bring. What we believe about sex, what we believe about singleness, what we believe about marriage and about divorce. So these beliefs are crucial because they shape our expectations and they shape our actions. If we believe that sex is dirty, that will impact our approach to it and our experience of it. If we believe that celibacy is damaging to us, we might well consider alternatives. If we believe the purpose of marriage is to aid us in our individual pursuit of self-fulfillment, then we might well consider ending the marriage if that is stifled. See, our beliefs about sex and relationships are crucial, and so it's worth considering, where are we getting them from? Where are we getting our beliefs from? See, when it comes to sex and relationship, we are profoundly shaped by the culture around us, by the fairy stories we grew up with, by the songs that we love, by the movies we watch, by the images we see in the media, by the attitudes of our friends, the things that they say as we're growing up. And more than any of that, by the lived out beliefs of the family that we grew up in. There's a set of beliefs about relationships embedded in all of those cultural inputs. There's a theology of relationships there, and we're shaped by them. An important question for us as followers of Jesus, as members of his cross-shaped communities, an important question for us is our theology of relationships shaped by God's revealed will? Has it been revolutionised by God's good plan? Is it cross-shaped? Or is it largely shaped by our culture with a veneer of Christian rules imposed on top? The Corinthians really needed a cross-shaped theology of relationships. Their actions were still very much shaped by the theology of relationships of the culture around them. They needed a cross-shaped transformation. And so far in the letter, Paul has begun that work of that cross-shaped transformation. We've seen in chapters 5 and 6 already that he raised with them and then addressed specific instances of sexual immorality. And then now, in today's passage, chapter 7, he responds to their questions that they've raised with him about this topic. And as he does so, we have a precious opportunity to have our sex and relationships beliefs shaped by God, shaped according to God's good plan. This is an opportunity for you and I to develop and to strengthen a cross-shaped theology of relationships. So let's dive in. We're going to learn something about sex, something about singleness, and then something about marriage. And we're going to start, as Paul does, with sex. So in the first 6 verses, we learn that sex is good. Sex is good. You'll see that in verse 1, Paul starts by quoting one of their slogans that they've raised in their letter to him. Now, this is a slogan which has embedded in it a theology that sex is bad. Have a look at that, verse 1. Now for the matters you wrote about. It's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. That's their slogan. It's good to not have sex. Sex is bad. It seems that some in the Corinthian church were influenced by Greek philosophical thinking about the body and the spirit, where the body is lower and baser and unspiritual, and the spirit is higher and more noble and more spiritual. And so for them, the path to being more spiritual is to abstain from sex. Hence the slogan, it's good for a man not to have sex. So we can see that there must have been at least more than one theology of sex going around in the Corinthian church at the time, because last week, chapter 6, there were some who believed that they were free to have sex with anyone they liked, including prostitutes. And here we see that there were others who were calling for abstinence from sex altogether. So it's no wonder that they wrote to Paul and asked for clarification on this matter. We've got the licentious group in chapter 6 who says any sex is fine. We've got the restrictive group in chapter 7 that say any sex is bad. And Paul says to both of these groups, you are wrong. You've got this wrong. Sex is good. It's very good in its God-given context. That is, between a husband and a wife. Verse 2, have a look at that. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. So in response to their slogan, which said it's good to not have sex, Paul says, no. It's precisely because of the sexual immorality that we've been speaking about, sex with prostitutes in chapter 6. It's precisely because of those temptations to misuse sex that we need to encourage it. We need to foster it in its God-given context. Each man should, says Paul, have sex with his wife, and each woman with her husband. This is not an option for married couples. This is a command to them. In fact, it's a covenantal duty, he goes on to say in verse 3. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. When Paul talks about a marital duty here, he's harking back to the very start, to creation, where God created marriage as a covenant in which a man would leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they would become one flesh. You see, built into this covenant of marriage is a duty, is an obligation to have sex with each other. Because sex is good, and it needs to be encouraged in its God-given context. In fact, part of being bound by covenant into this one flesh relationship means that, verse 4, your body isn't even your own anymore. It also belongs to your partner, and your partner's also belongs to you. You each give your bodies to each other in a mutual, voluntary giving. That is the beauty and the wonder of sex in marriage. Sex is good in its God-given context. And because of that, a God-given response to the temptation of sexual immorality is not to not have sex, as per the slogan, but to have it a lot in its God-given context. Verse 5. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. See, the verse 1 slogan people thought that by abstaining they could become more spiritual. And Paul says, no, if you're married, the opposite is true. By abstaining, you could set yourself up for spiritual collapse. By abstaining, you could invite the temptations of Satan. So if you're married, don't go a long time without sex. Don't set yourself up for a fall. Apart from short periods of mutually agreed abstinence so that you can pray, Paul says don't abstain. Have sex often. Sex is good in its God-given context. So that's Paul's response to their slogan. He completely slams it. They thought that it was a good thing spiritually to not have sex. And Paul says, if you're married, it's a good thing spiritually to have sex. They thought that the non-bodily things were more spiritual. And Paul says, no, body and soul are both important parts of our spiritual lives. They thought that abstaining from things bodily was the path to spiritual maturity. And Paul says, Satan is actually active in that bodily realm. And so one way married couples can counter his temptations is by embracing God's good plan for sex and having it often. Now, I said before, our beliefs shape our actions. Just like a rudder directs a ship, so too our beliefs about sex, our theology of sex, is going to shape what we do, where we go. Remember the newlyweds, Ravi and Mia, from the start. Remember how, as a Christian, Ravi, he believes in having sex with his wife, Mia. He even wishes it would go well, but in practice, he is dreading it. What Ravi hasn't yet acknowledged is how much he's been shaped by the theology of sex of his parents. That sex is dirty, that sex is part of our lower physical nature. Just like the Corinthians, Ravi needs a deep worldview change. He needs to know that sex is good. It's given by God to be enjoyed regularly. Maybe that particular cultural belief about sex, that sex is dirty or spiritually base, which is actually still quite common in many parts of the world, maybe that one isn't the one that you have been most influenced by. Maybe you're more influenced by another cultural view of sex. One of the ones which is very common in the West today is that sex is a path to individual fulfillment. It's a way to express yourself, to be yourself, to find yourself. That particular view doesn't say sex is bad, but it's still a very long way from the picture of sex that we find, the theology of sex that we find in 1 Corinthians 7. That particular view is very me-focused. It's very individual-focused. It's about me, the individual, pursuing my own journey towards self-realization, and the sexual partner becomes a means to an end. That view also misses out on the strength and the richness of the context which God gives us for sex, which is a covenant with mutual obligations, with mutual voluntary self-giving that results in two becoming one flesh, where sex is an opportunity to give and serve another, to delight another, to be delighted by another. Are there traces of that view, that individual self-fulfillment view of sex, in your beliefs about sex, your theology of sex? So that's what Paul says about sex. Sex is good. Let's move on now to what he says about singleness. Singleness is good. Singleness is good. Verse 8. Now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. Singleness is good. It is good, says Paul. It is good for you to stay that way if you are unmarried. Singleness is good. In fact, he anticipated this in the previous verse, verse 7, when he said, I wish that all of you were as I am. At some level, Paul, a single man, wishes that everyone could be single like him because singleness is good. Why is singleness good? Well, Paul doesn't say here, but if we read on in the chapter and get towards the end of the chapter, we see that he explains that a single person is able to devote themselves to the Lord's work in a way that a married person cannot. And we'll come back to this in a few weeks' time. But for now, we can say that singleness is good for that reason. But, embedded in these verses, it's not for all. Verse 7, Paul says, I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Singleness is good, but it's not for all. Verse 9, but if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. See, one of the reasons that a single person might wisely pursue marriage, and I take it that there are others when we read the Bible more broadly, but one reason is because they are burning with passion. That is, they're unable to show self-control sexually. So singleness is good, but it's not for all. Now, if that's the case, how do we know if it's for us? In verse 7, Paul refers to his own singleness as a gift. How do we know if we have that gift? Now, this is important because if we misunderstand this gift, it could lead to unwise or ungodly choices. It's good to remember that when we talk about being single, people might be single for all sorts of different reasons. It's good to remember that. Some are widowed, some are divorced, some are same-sex attracted, and so as Christians have committed to a life of singleness and celibacy. Some have committed to singleness so they can devote themselves to gospel ministry. And some would like to be married, but haven't yet found a marriage partner. All sorts of different reasons why people might be single. How does this gift of singleness fit into that? Do all singles have this gift? As single pastor and author Sam Albury, who visited SMBC last year, puts it, he says, if you're a single person who wants to be married, the gift of singleness might feel like that Christmas present you get from the uncle who doesn't know you very well. It's an unwanted gift. What is it? What is this gift that Paul's talking about in verse 7? Let's start with what it's not. It is not the ability to live the single life without any struggle as a single. That's not what the gift is. It's not a special ability to experience no challenges associated with single life, for example, having no sexual desires or not longing for a marriage partner. That's not what the gift is. Gifts don't work like that. None of the gifts work like that. Having a gift from God doesn't mean that exercising that gift will always be easier without struggle. If you have the gift of leadership, it doesn't mean that you won't have struggles fulfilling that role as a leader. If you have the gift of teaching, it doesn't mean that you won't labour over your sermon. Gifts aren't like powers of a superhero. And the gift that Paul is talking about here isn't one that necessarily makes single life easy. Now, this is important because if that's what we think the gift is, you might say, well, I'm finding singleness hard, so I mustn't have the gift. And then that might lead you to take unwise steps or ungodly steps, perhaps by marrying someone who would inhibit your service of the Lord, or perhaps by seeking sexual pleasure in ungodly ways. See, if we find ourselves going down the path of justifying ungodliness or sin because we think we lack a particular gift, we must have got our understanding of that gift wrong, because God doesn't set us up for a fall like that. So that's what the gift is. And what is the gift then? Well, it's good to think about what gifts are for Paul in his writings. And for Paul, a gift is not how hard or easy you might experience something to be, but for Paul, a gift is always an opportunity or an ability that God gives to us to build others up. That's what a gift is, an opportunity or an ability he gives us to edify the church. So when Paul speaks in verse 7 of the gift that he has as a single, what he's talking about, I think, is the opportunity he has, the ability he has as a single to build others up, to serve the church. The opportunity he has, the ability he has as a single to devote himself to the work of the Lord. That's what the gift is. And you can have that gift whether or not you're experiencing singleness to be something hard or a struggle. We don't know. It may have been that Paul longed for a wife at some point. But the gift for Paul was, for as long as he found himself to be single, he made the most of the opportunities that singleness afforded him by devoting himself to gospel ministry. So singleness is good, says Paul. What about Lena, the single woman who fears that celibacy might be harmful to her? Well, based on what we've read here, if Lena is burning with passion, there may be wisdom, verse 9, in her seeking a marriage partner. But who knows when or if she will find a suitable one. Even more fundamentally, what Lena needs, what we need, is a cross-shaped theology of singleness. Don't forget, our beliefs, they shape our expectations, they shape our experiences, our actions, just like a rudder directs a ship. What Lena needs to know is that singleness is good. She needs to know that the good God who knows her better than she knows herself, who created her, who orders all things for her good, she needs to know that he declares in his word that singleness is good. She also needs to know that sexual desire is not like hunger for food, something that we must satisfy in order to survive. She needs to know that celibacy won't damage her. On the contrary, it is the God-given best possible way for her to live for as long as she is single. She needs to allow her beliefs, her theology to be thoroughly shaped by God's good plan as revealed in his word. So we've seen so far that sex is good and that singleness is good. Now we're going to move on to marriage. The message here is that permanence of marriage is good. Verse 10. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. So permanence of marriage is good. If you're married, don't separate, don't divorce, but if you do, remain unmarried or seek reconciliation. Permanence of marriage is good. That's the message to Christians married to Christians. Next, Paul moves on to Christians married to unbelievers. Verse 12. He says, to the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. Just a quick note on that phrase, I, not the Lord. When Paul says that, he's not saying what I'm about to say has less authority. What he's saying is that unlike what he just said in verse 10, which was not I, the Lord, back then he was quoting Jesus directly, something Jesus had spoken about. Now he's speaking about a scenario that Jesus didn't speak about. But as he speaks about it, he does so with full apostolic authority. So let's keep reading verse 12. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she's willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. The background to this is probably that in the Corinthian church, there would have been people who were already married when they came to faith, but their spouse didn't come to faith. And so Paul's message to these people is don't initiate a divorce. Permanence of marriage is good, even a marriage to an unbeliever. So don't initiate a divorce. Now, if the unbeliever leaves you, verse 15, let it be so, he says. You're not bound there. But as a believer, you won't be the one to initiate a divorce. Why not? Well, he gives two reasons. First of all, in verse 14, he says that by staying married, the unbelieving spouse is sanctified through you. And second, in verse 16, he says if you stay married, there's a chance that the unbelieving spouse will come to faith and be saved through you. Now, that first reason, the one in verse 14, might sound strange, right? Because normally we think of someone who's sanctified as someone who is saved. But sanctified doesn't always have to mean that, and it can't mean that here, because the second reason in verse 16 is that you don't know if they'll be saved or not. So what verse 14 probably means here is that the unbelieving spouse is exposed at close quarters day by day to the gospel lived out, and so in that sense is sanctified, is set apart. You might think as an analogy of Romans 3, where Paul lists all the advantages of being a Jew. Remember that part of Romans? Access to the words of God, to the covenant, to the promises, to the circumcision. Does that save the Jews? No, it doesn't guarantee their salvation, but they did have a privileged special access position. And in that sense, they were sanctified, they were set apart. So that seems to be the kind of thing that Paul has in mind in verse 15. The unbelieving spouse has special access to the gospel by living with the believer. Doesn't guarantee that they'll believe and be saved, but it does give them a special set-apart opportunity. So, permanence of marriage is good. God's good plan for marriage is that Christians stay married and that they don't initiate a divorce. Now, there will be marriages which, sadly, do end in divorce. Paul acknowledges that there in verse 11. He acknowledges it, and he acknowledges it again in verse 15. And if you read more widely, you'll see that Jesus also acknowledges this in his teaching. So we need to see this. We need to see that there will be circumstances where, notwithstanding God's good plan for marriage, separation or divorce are the best options in the circumstances. This will happen, this does happen, and when it does, it is hard, it is messy, it is crushing, it is wounding. And when it does happen, I want to say that if we are watching on, if we are friends, if we are fellow church members, we would be very wise to acknowledge that we don't know the full story. It's very easy for us to make a quick judgment, but if we don't know the full story, that would be a very foolish thing to do. What we need to do is support them to live for God and to live for his will at that time. What we shouldn't do is judge what we don't fully understand. So what about Kai and Kalina? They're considering separation because their individuality and their freedoms are being stifled. Just as a rudder directs a ship, so too our beliefs shape our actions. What theology is driving Kai and Kalina's actions? What theology has been driving the way they've been doing marriage for the last 17 increasingly difficult years? Is it one that sees marriage as good, marriage as permanent? Is it one that teaches married couples to set aside the pursuit of individual fulfillment for something far, far better, for something far more gospel-shaped? Or is it one that is drawing deeply on the cultures, on the world's view of marriage with a thin veneer of Christian rules about sex and divorce on top? Christian rules which they are finding increasingly hard to keep. At some point in a mission class here at SMBC, you probably come across the term syncretism. That's where Christian beliefs are mixed with some other set of beliefs. If it's an animist people, let's say, they might come to Christ, they might start going to church, they might start observing Christian behaviours and rules, but at the same time they also keep practising their old animist religion. When they get sick, they go to the witch doctor. They'll perform rituals to keep the evil spirits away. And what we have with that phenomenon of syncretism, what we have is the situation where deep worldview change hasn't yet happened. A radical reshaping of the people's theology hasn't yet happened. What they have is their old worldview with a veneer of Christian behaviour and rules imposed on top. Might we be in danger of syncretism when it comes to this whole area of sex and relationships? Might the beliefs of our culture continue to shape our deeply held worldview with just a veneer of Christian rules and behaviour imposed on top? Rules which get increasingly hard to follow because we lack the deep worldview to support them. A cross-shaped theology of relationships. That's what today has been about. Sex is good. Singleness is good. Permanence of marriage is good. I have two simple challenges for us to finish with. First one. Let's meditate deeply on God's good plan for relationships. Let's take syncretism prevention steps by drenching our hearts and minds with a true, with a good, with a cross-shaped theology of relationships. And second, let's make our Christian communities places that champion God's good plan for sex and for singleness and for marriage. And at the same time, hold out God's abundant grace to those who haven't always lived it out in the past, which one way or another is going to be all of us. See, we champion God's good plan by celebrating it, by affirming it, by showing its attractiveness, by supporting people in our community to live it out, by offering a counterpoint to the culture around us. You see, if we never counter our culture's individual self-fulfillment belief with a positive alternative, we shouldn't be surprised if the Kais and the Kalinas of our churches divorce. If we never counter our culture's life without sex is damaging belief with a positive alternative, we shouldn't be surprised if the leaners in our churches abandon God's good plan. So let's champion it. Let's champion God's good plan. And at the same time, let's continually affirm and hold out God's grace to those who haven't lived it out. Did you know that divorcees are one of the least represented groups in Australian churches? Did you know that guilt for sexual sin is one of the biggest barriers to Christian growth for many Christians? See, as we champion God's good plan, let's also be communities that continue to hold out his grace, because our God himself in his word does both of those things. Let's pray. Father God, make our heart and our mind on sex and relationships the same as yours. And make our Christian communities gracious communities that live it out. Amen.